What if everything you believe about wealth is a lie? Most people think making more money is the answer. Yet history proves otherwise. Why do dynasties that once ruled nations vanish within 3 generations, while others endure silently for centuries? The paradox is this: real wealth is not what you see but what no one can trace. Most people will spend their entire lives chasing income. They fight for raises, celebrate small bonuses, and cling to the idea that comfort equals progress. But when the final chapter closes, what remains? A larger house, a fleeting reputation, a lifestyle that disappears the moment the person does. Niccolo Machiavelli, though writing centuries before modern finance, would ask a piercing question: what did you actually build? Because money that dies with you is not wealth, it is simply consumption. True wealth outlives its creator. Generational wealth is not a bank balance or a brand. It is an architecture, a system of influence and protection that survives time, chaos, and betrayal. This form of wealth is not emotional, not flamboyant, not even visible. It is silent, structured, and fortified against exposure. Machiavelli understood a fundamental law that remains just as powerful today. What can be seen can be attacked, but what remains hidden endures. This is where the first law of building legacy begins. Do not focus on becoming rich. Focus on becoming unassailable. Millionaires vanish into bankruptcy courts every year because they built income, not ecosystems. They tied their fortunes to their own effort, charisma, or visibility. When they disappeared, so did their wealth. The Machiavellian alternative is to design systems that generate value without your presence, assets that defend themselves without requiring your reputation, and structures that conceal more than they reveal. Consider the difference between a consultant who earns handsomely from personal skill and a silent partner who owns equity in firms that will keep generating profits for decades. The consultant's wealth collapses when his health fails. The silent partner's wealth expands untouched by his absence. One dies with money, the other leaves behind a fortress. That fortress is invisible, fragmented legally, and protected by layers of trust and corporate shells. But Machiavelli would add something deeper. Even if you build an empire of assets, if your heirs inherit weakness, the fortress will eventually fall from within. A fortune passed to soft hands becomes a curse. This is why the second law of generational wealth is brutal. Never let your family inherit weakness. Money without mentality destroys faster than poverty. History is full of founders whose sons wasted fortunes on vanity or whose daughters entrusted wealth to destructive partners. The Machiavellian response is not to shelter heirs from pain, but to expose them to controlled hardship. Teach control before access, discipline before abundance. Build character first, wealth later. A dynasty survives not through unconditional love, but through psychological armor. Machiavelli would rather leave behind a mind trained in scarcity, patience, and discipline than a vault filled with gold. The vault can be stolen, but the mind can rebuild an empire. And here lies the most uncomfortable truth. Your real inheritance is not property or accounts, but mentality. The third law of Machiavellian wealth is deceptively simple. Hide the engine, show only the result. Generational wealth fails when it becomes a spectacle. The more visible the source, the more vulnerable the system. Once others understand where your power comes from, they will work to dismantle it. If they cannot attack the man, they will target the method. If they cannot reach the vault, they will strike at the structure that surrounds it. The strategic answer is separation. Let people see the lifestyle, but never the mechanism. Allow the world to assume your fortune came from talent, timing, or even luck, but guard the machine with secrecy. This means never centralizing ownership under your personal name. It means diversifying not only assets, but the very locations and legal systems in which they are held. A single account can be frozen, A single company can be taxed or litigated. A single jurisdiction can change the rules overnight. But a maze of trusts holding companies in geographic separation ensures that no one can bring down the empire with a single strike. Wealth in this sense is not a vault, it is a labyrinth. Only those trained within the family understand how to navigate it. Yet here lies the paradox. To truly build wealth that lasts beyond death, you must accept being forgotten. Machiavelli would have ridiculed the modern obsession with branding legacies into building statues or family names etched on corporations. Visibility is vanity, and vanity is fragile. If the world remembers your face, it also remembers your weaknesses. A dynasty that insists on public recognition inevitably paints a target on itself. Instead, the wiser move is to let your bloodline remember you privately, while the outside world forgets. Your name does not need to live forever. Your framework does. This brings us to the fourth law: protect your wealth, not only from enemies, but from the people you love. The cruel reality is that those closest to you often pose the greatest risk. A spouse who mismanages influence, children who crave shortcuts, relatives with opinions, but no skin in the game, all can erode the foundations of what you built. Machiavelli believed loyalty only mattered when it aligned with interest. And nowhere is this more critical than in estate planning. The defensive answer is structure, not sentiment. Bulletproof trusts with strict behavioral clauses, prenuptial agreements to shield equity from divorce, and inheritance systems that reward discipline rather than entitlement. You do not rely on hope that your heirs will act responsibly. You design a framework in which irresponsibility automatically disqualifies them. Love is expressed not through unlimited access, but through rules that ensure continuity. The dynasty must be engineered to outlast emotional appeals, because legacy cannot rest on trust alone. The fifth law is equally uncompromising: build income that outlives trends. You cannot pass down relevance. You cannot pass down a personal brand. The influencer who thrives on being seen leaves nothing once the spotlight fades. The performer's charisma dies with him. What remains for heirs must be boring, durable, and indifferent to popularity cycles. Cash-flowing assets in fundamental industries, intellectual property secured in perpetuity, and entities designed to serve needs that never disappear. This is the foundation of anti-fragility. To think like Machiavelli is to think like an architect, not a performer. You are not building a spectacle. You are building a machine. The sixth law of Machiavellian wealth addresses one of the most overlooked dangers of inheritance: untested heirs. Machiavelli despised the notion of passing power without preparation. He observed kingdoms collapse because fathers handed sons gold but not grit. Wealth without trial creates weakness, and weakness invites collapse. The antidote is deliberate testing. You do not prepare heirs by handing them lectures or theoretical lessons. You prepare them by throwing them into controlled battles where mistakes carry consequences. Imagine an heir tasked with managing a small division of a family business. If he fails, the losses are real but not catastrophic. If he succeeds, he gains not only money, but experience forged in fire. Responsibility, delayed access, and exposure to failure are the crucibles that form protectors, not consumers of wealth. Machiavelli would argue that this is not cruelty, but necessity. Your heirs are not being trained to enjoy comfort. They are being trained to defend an empire against a world eager to dismantle it. This naturally leads to the seventh law: build legacy in the shadows. In every age, those who demanded statues and monuments became vulnerable to envy and rebellion. The greater the public recognition, the more predictable the attack. A dynasty survives best when it matures silently, shielded from the spotlight until its roots are too deep to unearth. To build in shadows is not weakness, it is strategy. Visibility creates applause, but applause creates exposure, and exposure is the enemy of permanence. The eighth law is perhaps the harshest teach heirs to fear entitlement. Entitlement is a cancer that grows inside the walls of legacy. It convinces heirs that wealth is their birthright, not a responsibility. Once that mindset takes hold, vigilance collapses. Machiavelli's solution was ruthless restriction. Access must always be conditional. The family structure must reward effort and punish arrogance. Assets are not tickets to pleasure, but tests of loyalty and competence. Every dollar inherited should feel like a burden of duty, not a gift. In this way, gratitude is trained, not assumed. The ninth law reinforces the architecture of resilience design systems immune to emotional decisions. Most dynasties implode not from external threats, but from internal chaos. Divorces, deaths, lawsuits, addictions, feuds. Emotional storms destroy wealth faster than economic downturns. The Machiavellian countermeasure is structure immune to panic. Succession plans that lock into place automatically veto powers that prevent rash decisions, asset freezes triggered by instability, and governance frameworks that operate independently of any one person's mood. By binding the system to rules rather than emotions, you prevent decades of work from collapsing in a single impulsive act. Finally, the 10th law warns against building what can be stolen. Wealth tied directly to your personal name, visible assets, or single jurisdictions is vulnerable. A lawsuit, a tax shift, or a political decree can dismantle in weeks what took decades to create. The Machiavellian builder does not own wealth in the conventional sense. He owns nothing directly but controls everything indirectly through layers of entities and protections. What cannot be traced cannot be seized. What cannot be seen cannot be targeted. Wealth, therefore, must be invisible power, not visible property. The 11th law of Machiavellian wealth demands a shift in perspective. Build not for your children, not even for your grandchildren, but for descendants you will never meet. This law strips away emotion and replaces it with architecture. Most men labor for their children's comfort. The strategic mind builds systems that can operate for 50 years, even 100 without needing the founder's presence. That is why dynasties establish family offices, perpetual trusts, and foundations that hold land or intellectual property far beyond the lives of their creators. True sovereignty requires planning cycles longer than one lifetime. When you build with this lens, you stop asking, "How do I help my children live better?" and instead ask, "How do I design a machine that evolves without me?" The 12th law continues this theme of invisibility. Silence is the insurance of power. In today's digital culture, influence is confused with strength, yet Machiavelli would caution that the loud are the easiest to destroy. The more people know what you own, the more vulnerable you become. Real dynasties walk quietly through history. They do not flaunt assets, post accounts, or explain strategies. They allow myths to form around them, while their true structures remain untouchable. Silence is not weakness, it is armor. The 13th law is perhaps the most brutal the empire must run without the emperor. If the presence of the founder is essential, then the system is merely wealth on a timer. Generational wealth requires complete detachment from personality. Operators must be trained, structures must be self-sustaining, and governance must function as though the founder were already gone. Machiavelli would remind us that passion fades, charisma dies, but systems endure. The architect of resilience is not a performer, but a strategist who can step away and still watch the machine run flawlessly. The 14th law addresses the seduction of modern influence. In the digital era, visibility feels like power. Followers, platforms, and media coverage appear to expand reach, but influence is not control. It is exposure disguised as leverage. One lawsuit, one cancellation, or one regulatory change can evaporate public power overnight. The Machiavellian response is separation. You build two structures, a visible frame that can absorb attacks and an invisible core that no one can touch. The public identity may play the game, but the private architecture remains untouchable. This ensures that even if the visible figure is dismantled, the dynasty's true engine remains intact. The 15th law ensures survival through modularity. Concentrated wealth is fragile wealth. One company, one industry, one currency, one jurisdiction. This is not a fortress, but a time bomb. A single collapse brings down everything. The Machiavellian strategy is to spread influence across multiple sectors, multiple geographies, and multiple legal layers. Each unit functions independently, but together they form a constellation. When one is attacked, the rest adapt. This is how certain families survive wars, revolutions, and recessions without ever appearing in headlines. Their wealth does not depend on a single pillar, but on an intricate web, flexible and unbreakable. Wealth that is modular cannot be destroyed, it only reshapes. The 16th law of Machiavellian wealth is to protect the narrative of the name. Assets can endure, but without meaning they eventually dissolve into fragments. A dynasty must not only preserve capital, but also preserve story. Stories outlive contracts. They guide behavior when documents are forgotten. This means documenting the rise of the family, the values it defends, the code of conduct it refuses to compromise. Without narrative, heirs invent their own, diluting the foundation with guilt or modern concessions. With narrative, they inherit clarity and direction. The 17th law enforces conditional inheritance. Nothing must ever be guaranteed. Love should be certain, but access must always be tested. When heirs know everything can be revoked, they remain vigilant. Performance, discipline, and loyalty become the keys to the fortress. This principle keeps fire alive in each generation. Wealth is not a cushion. It is a weight-demanding responsibility. The 18th law is discipline over power. Access is delayed until character is proven. Control is not granted by age, but by behavior. The empire bends only for execution, not for emotion. The 19th law teaches heirs to master time, the most valuable asset of all. To sell time is servitude. To own time is sovereignty. Patience, compounding, and endurance are strategies stronger than any trend. The 20th law teaches wealth as language. It is not mathematics, it is psychology. Negotiation, contracts, and taxes are codes to be read and manipulated. Only fluency in this hidden dialect ensures survival. And the 21st law commands that once the system is complete, the blueprint must be burned. You leave principles, not maps. The empire must adapt with each generation, rebuilt in part to ensure ownership and vigilance. This is the Machiavellian path to generational wealth. Invisible, disciplined, resilient, and untouchable. Not celebrated, but undefeated.